It's great to be here today, especially since I've always watched a lot of TED Talks. And actually, I was watching one of them recently, and I discovered that one of the most frequent regrets people have is this one. I always wanted to start a business, but I never had the guts to do it. And as an entrepreneurship researcher and educator, I can totally see why we think that. We often hear that being an entrepreneur means taking risk, or that starting a new business means that you have to try things that might ultimately just not work. But what I want to discuss with you today is that starting a new business doesn't have to mean blindly taking risk. In fact, I spent the last 8 years working with some colleagues to analyze the process more than 700 entrepreneurs have gone through. In a series of studies, my co-authors and I are looking at two different groups of entrepreneurs. One is treating their business like a scientific project, and the other one isn't. But aside from this, the two groups are comparable on pretty much any characteristic you can think of. We follow these entrepreneurs for some time, and the key finding is that treating a business like a scientific project is linked to entrepreneurial success and de-risking business ideas in pretty powerful ways. Now, a great example of how to treat a business like a scientific project is what the founders of Mimoto did. Mimoto is a startup that created an app that allows users to rent electric scooters for very short periods of time, even just a few minutes. And the founders' idea was extremely simple. They observed the situation of the city they were in, and their theory was that their business could have been successful because pollution and traffic are two huge problems. So having electric scooters could have been a great solution because, first of all, they don't generate toxic emissions, and second, they allow drivers to move very quickly within the city. Now, this story is something that happened a few years ago, and so at the time, electric share mobility was quite new. The founders couldn't just go ahead, launch their service, and see how it would perform, but they had to take a step back and think about how to de-risk their idea. Their key hypothesis was that this service could have been particularly valuable for people who cared about sustainability, that couldn't necessarily afford to own a vehicle, but for whom these problems of pollution and traffic were quite relevant. So they thought about university students, and in fact, when they were university students themselves, they thought about this idea. Now, they started interviewing the students, and they realized that safety was a big concern for them. So they started running a number of tests, and one which I find quite interesting is the one where they took a bunch of large scooters, which are usually perceived as quite safe. They set up a stall outside of the university, and they got the students to try this prototype of the service to see whether they were interested in hearing more when the service would officially launch. Well, they discovered two important facts. The first one is that these large scooters are pretty hard to move. And the second one is that university students were not very interested in this service. So this turned out to be a great test if you think about it, because they learned that they had to focus on a different type of scooter and look at different type of customers. The founders decided to take a step back, think about their business, run more tests, and delay launching by 1 year. But when they ended up launching with a very different type of scooter, which is the one that you're seeing in this photo, they ended up being very successful. And in fact, they got more than 50,000 users to sign up within the first few months of operations. I am personally a huge fan of Mimoto's story because it shows the simple steps that entrepreneurs can take to replicate the approach that scientists are using when they're trying to understand reality and generate new knowledge. Treating a business like a scientific project means using a scientific approach. And I understand that calling it a scientific approach might make it sound daunting, but when I break this down to its key building blocks, you will realize that it's almost intuitive. And the great news is that there are only 4 steps that you need to take in order to start applying this approach. So let's go through them. The first step is to start with why. And in particular, entrepreneurs should ask themselves, why should my business be successful? When they do this, entrepreneurs are doing something which is quite close to what scientists are doing when coming up with a theory. If you think about it, scientists are usually very curious about the reality around them, and They want to understand why things work the way they do. A great example of a typical scientific question is, why does the Earth revolve around the sun? And this is a question that has encouraged scientific research for hundreds of years. In the context of entrepreneurship, a theory of a business allows entrepreneurs to look at their customers, understand what their problems or needs are, and figure out why their business should be successful in addressing these problems or needs. A theory is very important for entrepreneurs because it allows them to take a step back and look at their business from a very different perspective, and in particular, to understand whether it has a reason to be in the first place. In the context of Mimoto, their key theory was that an electric scooter sharing service would be successful because traffic and pollution are two big problems, particularly for university students. Now, what I like about the Mimoto's example is that the founders didn't just assume that their logic was right, but instead they went out to conduct some tests. Even if they themselves, when they were students, they would have wanted a service like Mimoto quite badly. This brings us to the second step, which is to question your own thinking. In order to do this, scientists and entrepreneurs need to develop hypotheses. If you think about it, theories tend to be quite broad, quite abstract, so they cannot be tested directly. But what hypotheses do is that they allow to take that theory and logically derive simple facts that can be tested in the field or in the lab or in reality. Basically, the way it works is that scientists and entrepreneurs think about their theory. If their theory accurately describes reality, then when I do X, I should observe Y. And hypotheses are so powerful because they actually take logic from the theory and they make it testable by attaching very specific characteristics to each aspect that entrepreneurs want to test. In the case of Mimoto, the theory that electric scooter sharing service would have been successful because pollution and traffic are two big issues for young students led them to develop a key hypothesis, which was that basically 60% of young university students aged 19 to 25 would have been interested in signing up for their service had it been available to them. Hypotheses are essentially a bridge between a theory and test, which represent the next step. This is all about collecting solid evidence. And this might be where the parallel between entrepreneurs and scientists is a bit more obvious. If you think about famous scientists like Archimedes or Newton or Marie Curie, you're probably imagine them in a lab or in a field running hundreds of experiments. So you're probably thinking, well, how do entrepreneurs actually run tests and gather data without the sophisticated and expensive equipment that scientists have? Actually, entrepreneurs have shown some serious creativity when it comes to finding ways to gather data. I already talked about Mimoto earlier, but there are so many other examples. One that comes to mind is what Drew Houston did. Drew Houston is the founder of Dropbox. And way before the file sharing service was ready, he created a simple 3-minute video that he uploaded online. The video showed what the software could do, and that video drove thousands of users to sign up to Dropbox waiting lists practically overnight. This turned out to be a great and simple way to test the key hypothesis that there was demand for Dropbox services. But beyond this, there are so many other tools that entrepreneurs can use to gather data. One that I particularly like is qualitative interviews. Going out, talking to customers, conducting in-depth interviews can be extremely valuable. One example is a group of university students that wanted to commercialize a robot that can, in complete autonomy, cut grass. They went out to interview homeowners, and they realized by talking to them that an expensive and sophisticated robot would not have been adequate for people who have a small plot of land and don't need maintenance very regularly. But these interviews turned out to be quite helpful because they helped them realize that other users, perhaps that had bigger plots of land, like farmers that require regular maintenance, could have found the robot a very efficient solution to their problems. Now, I'm going to stop here for a second because I want to make a very important point. which is that it's hard to design and run very rigorous tests. But the key point I want to make is that it's so beneficial for entrepreneurs to move beyond the unstructured conversations or the unsystematic data collection processes that oftentimes they tend to engage in. And this is actually closely linked to the fourth and final step: base decisions on facts and not opinions. If you think about scientists, they often look at the data, results from their test, and based on that, they revisit their theory and their hypothesis. They, in a nutshell, update their beliefs about what they think is happening. Entrepreneurs often find themselves in a similar situation, and in fact, oftentimes results from tests do not support initial hypotheses. So what can entrepreneurs do? Well, the entrepreneurs I studied chose two different paths. Some of them decided to close their business, and others decided to pivot or change something in their business project. For the entrepreneurs that decided to close their business, it was actually very interesting to dig deeper into why they did that. And a key aspect that emerged is that these entrepreneurs that use a scientific project approach tend to close their business because they realize that there is actually no market for their product or need. And of course, closing a business is usually considered a failure, but when you look at it from the perspective of science, it can actually be seen as a success. Because first of all, these entrepreneurs are not wasting time or money on a project that would have probably gone nowhere. But at the same time, they're taking a step forward in becoming closer to understanding reality. But there are also cases in which entrepreneurs, as I mentioned, decide to change something in their business idea. And usually when they do that, they reconsider their logic based on the results of the test. In the case of Mimoto, for instance, when they realized that university students didn't really care about their service, they started thinking about what other users had similar characteristics. For instance, they cared about sustainability, they couldn't necessarily afford to own a vehicle, and cared about traffic and pollution. They realized that young professionals fit all these different characteristics, and they decided to revisit their hypothesis, conduct more tests, and they realized that in fact they were right. In fact, young professionals are still Mimoto's main customer segment. Overall, in all these studies, results indicate that using a scientific approach is very beneficial for entrepreneurs and improves their performance in many different dimensions. To sum it all up, making decisions for one business is very difficult, and that is often the case because entrepreneurs tend to lack a method. But the scientific approach, which I just illustrated, and these 4 key steps, is a logic that can help entrepreneurs make more informed decisions by combining both logic and evidence. I've personally seen the impact that it has on many entrepreneurs and also on the MBA students in my classroom. And this experience also prompted me to think about the many different ways in which science might play a role in our society and daily lives. I have some examples for you. A lot of large organizations, particularly in the digital sectors, run experiments on hundreds of users on their platform every day. They're doing that to optimize the user experience, but as a consequence, you might be taking part in experiments without even knowing it. Policymakers are using a very similar approach when deciding which policies to roll out. They start with a theory of change, they develop key hypotheses, and they test them with rigorous experiments. Basically, science plays an important role in our daily lives, not just because it enables a lot of the innovations and technology that we use every day, but also because it provides an architecture for entrepreneurs to better understand reality and create new businesses. Our vision of entrepreneurship really has to include science more than anything. And so for those of you who are thinking about becoming entrepreneurs, this is what I've come to tell you. Starting a new business doesn't have to be risky if you treat it like a scientific project. Thank you very much for your attention.